I called the presentation Islamic Reformist Thoughts in Western Europe. When talking about Western Europe, I want to address the context of Europe except the UK. Mostly France, Germany, Switzerland, where I'm from, but not exclusively. And the idea here is to show different trends in the thought we have in those countries that may not be the same debate here in the UK. And Zakat will be an illustration to speak about reformism in Islam, but I will define what I mean by reformism a bit later. First of all, talking about France, it's very important to note that the context has changed after the terrorist attacks in 2015, in Charlie Hebdo and the attack of the 13 November, where the state and the civil society asked for Muslims, they asked the Muslims to develop a new debate about Islam, about what Islam means, and try to find ways to define what Islam should be at that time, at that specific context. So there was a demand from above, from the government, but at the same time, a lot of Muslims also get confused about what Islam really teach. And that's what we need to situate that in order to comprehend what's going on in that specific case. Because, first of all, I would like to situate my talk. I've thought about that. I thought about Islam for the first time in 2005. I began to study Islam and to take part to various Muslim organizations and Muslim movements, such as the Tablighi, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood, or the Ahbash, or the Salafi Wahhabi also. Just because I was new in Islam and I tried to understand what's going on, at that time I began to look at their message, but I never heard about reformism at that time. And now it's a very different period where nobody can ignore this debate. But reformism in Islam has a large variety of understandings and explanations. It's not the same definition. So that's a problematic term, as people will call them reformist, but it doesn't mean the same. And to talk about that, I decided to introduce the problem of zakat for non-Muslims. Is zakat permissible to be given to non-Muslims or only to Muslims? And as I said, in the first movements I used to follow, had, despite of their differences, they had the common understanding that zakat was only for Muslims. That's what we heard in mosques, that's what we heard in classical Muslim circles or Muslim courses we got, regardless of the movement. All movements had the common understanding of zakat being for the Muslims. But now we hear other things. So I would like to try to explore this question about reformist Islam. First of all, what does it mean in that French-speaking context of Europe? It's important to make a distinction first between reformist Islam and traditionalist Islam. The intention here is to go back to the roots of Islam, but everybody would say that. So it's not an idea which is only in the reformist claims, but that's the main way they would introduce them to other people. But what's important here is a wish they have to tackle traditional interpretations in matter of fiqh positions, jurisprudence, but also in hadith. But the current of thought I would like to talk about today, referring to reformist Islam, is not like what we used to call historical critical approach as well, which are more labeled as progressive liberal Islam. Because the main difference for this current of thought of reformist Islam is that they still keep the Quran as the main source and the sacred reference. So they still consider the Quran, the Mus'haf we have, as the revelation, and they believe that the Mus'haf is in the good order. It was revealed as such, so they would not touch nothing from the Quran. But besides, they agree to tackle the hadith, even if it's called sahih, and the fiqh position. That's just a few words of methodology, but it's needed here to show some concrete examples, because I think it's quite difficult to follow like that in a few minutes. Here, I just write down quickly what I called controversial issues regarding to Islam today, which come both from outside the community and from inside. We can show a lot of examples, but I speak about slavery, young girls' marriage, to make reference to the age of Aisha when she got married to the Prophet ﷺ. Stoning to death for adultery, we talked about that now, and death sentence for apostasy or beating the wife. Why I wrote that quickly? Because that's what we hear. Again, my approach is inductive. It's from the ground, it's from what people think, it's not from the text. My approach is to go to the community and to listen to the debates, to the arguments they have. And based on that, I identified some problems, issues which are discussed. And after that, according to the Muslim movements, I could identify 3 main trends to explain, to give some narration, to give some logics to this stance. The first stance, or what people call literalist approach or Salafi approach, and the people say it's like that because it was narrated like this, is the tradition which said that, and therefore it should be implemented. So there's no issue with that. So till today, people believe that. You can find some people believing that all these problematic aspects are not problems because they were part of the Sunnah, according to what they believe. A second stand here, a second approach would say that it's true, the ahadith about that, the fiqh position are real, relevant, but it was in a context, social, cultural, political context, that is not here today anymore. And they say that we cannot do the same thing. So some people, for instance, they will believe that the Aisha got married when she was a child, but they say at that time it was not a problem for different reasons, but today is not possible. Then we have a third trend, which is even much more different than the 2 first ones. The people here say it was never, it didn't happen, it wasn't like that, the texts are fake. They say the ahadith are not sahih. The Prophet didn't say that, and the fiqh position was some mistakes of the scholars. Even if they respect the scholars, they would think that they made mistakes. That's the third trend, which I call here reformist approach of Islamic fiqh and ahadith. Here, very shortly, as we don't have time to discuss this, but I wanted to show you concrete names of Muslim scholars or Muslim thinkers who can be identified as this reformist trend. In Arabic speaking, in Austria, we had Adnan Ibrahim. He speaks Arabic, although he lives in Austria, who is very famous in the Arab world. We have also in France Mohamed Bajrafil, Tariq Ubru, Islam Ibn Ahmed, who are imams. They share more or less the same position. And here I wrote Abu Layth al-Maliki in the UK. Even if it may be controversial, but his methods look a bit the same as the others one. And also we have a link here with what we call Quraniyun, people setting the fiqh and ahadith aside to focus on the Quran. Farhan al-Maliki in Saudi Arabia is one of the well-known person representing that current. We have also Muhammad Shahrur in Syria, who just passed away. Muhammad Talbi is also passed away, but they wrote books with that very Quranic perspective when they just take their arguments from the Quran, which is different from the Reformist thinkers mentioned above, because they are not against the Sunnah, but they say that they have to check if the Sunnah is in line with the Quranic text and the reason. That's a different approach, though. Now, to come back to the question of the zakat for non-Muslims, the traditional interpretation we got in the mosques or in most Muslim organizations, at least in the countries I mentioned before, say that the zakat al-mal has to be given only to Muslims. It cannot be given to non-Muslims. That's what we learned for about 10 years. But it's more complicated than that, because if you read the Yusuf al-Qardawi books about zakat, big volumes about that fake statements, he quoted some different narrations that show that zakat is also for non-Muslims, according to a few Muslim scholars. But no, when coming to reformist views, we have three main interpretations here again of the people I mentioned in the precedent slides. The first one says that mu'allafa qulubuhum, reconciliation of hearts, means fostering social peace. So for them, it's a category of the zakat recipients which show that zakat can be given or should be given to non-Muslims as well than Muslim, especially in the European context. For instance, there is Mohammed Navid Johari in Germany. He wrote a master's thesis about that issue, and he argues that it's important for the German context to give zakat to non-Muslims. But another way to explain that is more in line with the reformists mentioned before. They say that zakat purpose is to tackle poverty, so it has nothing to do with being Muslims or not. A third way to understand it is the Quranic approach, which says that the zakat is not based on religious belonging in the Quran. The problem here with that third point, we can also argue that it's not written that we have to give to that 5% in the Quran. So for the last minute, I just want to show that these debates are very important. In the UK, you have NZF, National Zakat Foundation, which collected about 10 million pounds zakat. But they believe that zakat is for Muslims. So, of course, they give it back to the Muslims, but not to the non-Muslims. And if you imply that in Switzerland or in France, it's very difficult because we don't have any multicultural system, and this statement would not be accepted by the laws, not by the laws, but by the civil society or the government. And just a last word, today it's important to say that all these kind of issues Dr. spoke about before are to be addressed today by Muslims, because we cannot escape that anymore. During a long time we didn't hear about such debates, but now it comes from within the community, but also from outside. And the problem of this reformist trend is not so spread out, is not well known because it lacks funding, because of course it's not linked to governments or transnational Muslim movements, even if it may change in the future. But also they find a big issue with the people because they are likely to be attacked and to be labeled as fake Muslims, as reformist thinkers who may serve the interest of the power of the state, of the non-Muslims. And some people say that reformism means deconstruction, which means destruction of Islam. So somehow that's difficult for these thinkers to spread their ideas within the communities and mosques. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.